Good morning. It's great to be here. I first start with gratitude to Notre Dame. It changed the course of my life, and the seeds of my current role were planted at Notre Dame so long ago. Hopefully not so long ago, but long ago. I start also by saying that this is a dangerous topic. And I say that because when we talk about church management, I often get two reactions. Reaction one is, it sounds to me like you're trying to engineer the Holy Spirit. And the second topic is, it sounds to me like you're trying to replace the Holy Spirit with numbers. So my goal today is to try to show how management actually helps live out the Holy Spirit or discern the Holy Spirit. And we'll come to that as we go through it. My current role is the Chief Operating Officer of the Archdiocese of Chicago. I've held either that title or something similar over many years and had the good fortune and blessing to work with very closely with both Cardinal George and Cardinal Cupich. And so what I want to do today is just talk about church management and what it means, and to try to articulate how there are a new set of human skills that exist in the world that the church often misses, and that this is a very important area of co-responsibility because you won't find it necessarily in the church. You actually need to find it somewhere else. And so let me try to walk through that. I have two scripture passages from today, I think, that guide my thinking today. One is the letter of Corinthians that I know you're all familiar with around Paul's writing of the different kinds of spiritual gifts, but the same gift. Buried in that passage, albeit at the end, is the gift of administration that even Paul mentions of one of the many gifts. And the second one is from Matthew 13 that actually St. John Henry Newman reflected in one of his reflections and one of his homilies. That one of the beauties he saw of the Catholic Church was that, in his words, she carries her youth and middle age along with her onto the latest time. She does not change possessions, but accumulates them, and brings out of her treasure house, according to the occasion, things new and old. And so one of the things we want to talk about today is new skills that are in the world and how they help and serve the church. So the main messages for today, one is that our diocesan structures are actually large and complicated, and we tend to underestimate that at our peril. The second is that there is a new area of human skill, which is the government and management of large institutions. It's a skill in humanity that really is only developed in the last century that the church could benefit from. Third is I'll try to give a little bit more flavor of what that means. People often ask, like, what do you really do? And then the fourth one is I think I just want to be cognizant of the fact that I would say we're at an early age of discernment about what this means. It is not as easy as opening up and people flooding in with different skills. It's very difficult, I think, and we're still at the early stages of what that means. So let me start with the diocesan structures and how they might compare. So the Archdiocese of Chicago, as one example, has 316 parishes, 205 schools, 46 cemeteries, numerous social service agencies. And when we look at just some key statistics, annual operating budget of $1 billion, 15,000 employees across, 400,000 practicing Catholics, and 2 million total Catholics. Let me just compare it to an institution we all know and love. Notre Dame's revenue is not that different, actually has less employees and a lower constituent base. But when you think of Notre Dame, you think of resources, you think of management responsibility, you think of making sure it's got the governance and management it needs. And the difference between how Notre Dame thinks about, as one institution, what it takes to manage and govern versus what any diocese does is night and day. But yet the size of the institution is nearly the same. So there's something about how we need to think differently at the diocesan level. Second, bear with me for a moment as I try to give a sense of what this skill is and where it came from. First is the growth in the human population, right? If I go back to 1900, there was 1.6 billion people in the world. As of 2000, there were 6 billion people in the world. It was the largest growth in human population in human history. Secondly, if I go to what's happened with technology, think back to the turn of the century at 1900. Think back to what communications would have been like then. Think back to what transportation would have been then. Think back to what IT would have been back then. When you didn't have those advances, it was really hard to think about expanding in scope. But as technology advanced, so did the ability of institutions to expand their scope. Now, you may have points of view about was that a good thing or a bad thing for society, and I'm not planning to go there today. But the fact is that over the past century, very large institutions have emerged in the world. Many of them are businesses, many of them are non-government organizations. They wouldn't have existed like that only a century ago. So let's take Procter & Gamble as one example. In 1955, not too long after World War II, it would have considered, I think, be considered reasonably large even then. It had $900 million of revenue and was in 5 countries. Today, it has $67 billion of revenue and is in 180 countries. This is just one example. If you look at all kinds of statistics, there's been an emergence of these very large institutions. And again, you may have a point of view about whether that's a good thing for the world or not, but what it has led to is the development of human skill around how do you actually sit in a complex world and think about the management of these large institutions. Relatedly, the world has actually become much more complex. I won't have the charts here to show it, but in 1960, there were 23,000 pages in the Federal Code of Regulations. Today, there's 170,000 pages. Right? If you were to do a review of job descriptions, and a group did this, about 1960, you would have seen a lot of pretty basic words in the job descriptions. Manual, basic cognitive tasks. Today, words like interactive, analytic have grown exponentially in terms of what's required to do work in the world today. And so the world has become just a much more complex. So what that's led to is not only large institutions, it's actually led to a growing discipline around management and training. So I picked 4 example institutions. 2 of them, Penn and Harvard, were in existence before the Declaration of Independence. But all of these started to think about schools of management and schools of business really only in the last century. So there was some recognition then that there was some new way of training that we needed to train for the School of Management. And so those came into existence only a century ago. And so when we think about what's happened, the emergence of large institutions, growing complexity in the world, growing human population, there has emerged a profession. And just like surgeons go to school for a long period of time and then practice for a long period of time before they become surgeons, just like professors or lawyers, people who've been trained in the discipline of management, think of it as a profession just like any other profession. It starts with very significant training. It takes a long amount of experience before you're actually ready to assume a very significant role. And so I think that's one mindset I think we need to think about as we think about church management and governance. We often think we can train people who have no background in it whatsoever and maybe no aptitude into being very significant managers of large institutions. So when we talk today, some people, when they think about management, they think about this is about making institutions more efficient, or they think about this as making institutions somehow more bureaucratic, or making sure that that they just worry about the finances and worry about budgets. And so I'd like to use some examples today. I'm going to just give a flavor for what this means. But I think of it as 3 things. One is serving the mission of the church, and you'll see how management principles, I think, do help serve the mission of the church. 2, ensure strong and prudent stewardship. That does come into budgets and finance, but I think of stewardship broadly speaking. How do we think about better use of the full set of gifts that we have and bring? And when done well, helps foster unity, and I'll explain what that means when we get there. So I'll try to illustrate 7 dimensions of what this means as a way of trying to give some color to what it means and how it can be applied. And so I'll use a couple of images. The first I'll start with is a wide lens photographer. So a wide lens photographer is able to take a wider perspective than a traditional image, placing things in a wider context. Similarly, someone with strong management skill is able to see, through training and experience, often a larger picture connected to a decision or action than someone without that training might be able to see. And I'll give you an example. When I work with pastors in the Archdiocese of Chicago, this is exactly the conversation that often happens. they will often say to me, in the context of lots of challenges in the church, they will say, well, my parish is fine. I actually have a very healthy parishioner count. I have 1,200 parishioners. And so I have a healthy parishioner count. My finances are fine. We're doing great. We're very vibrant. And because our pastors often think in the here and now, what they will never recognize is that that's how their parish actually looks. And if you were to ask in the Archdiocese of Chicago, and if you were to ask most other dioceses who the vibrant parishes are, I guarantee you the majority of them have stats that look like that. And so if you think that your parish is fine like that, how you think about what you're going to do next is very different than if you think that that's your situation. And this goes to just, it's not that there's anything wrong with our vibrant parishes per se, it's just that the world has changed around us. We need to think about what evangelization is in today's world, and we often are doing that. And when you don't necessarily look at the trend and look at the numbers, you may not see the urgency in doing that. And so that's one example in the Archdiocese of Chicago, where many parishes are thinking very hard about what evangelization means today, how to bring a new young generation to a faith in Christ in a way that is going to be different than it might have been before, given some of these trends. I'll give you another brief example. We will often have people start a ministry because it sounds good. Now, this is an example of an ethnic ministry. Sounds like it's a need, and they'll just get started. It's a classic thing to do when we understand we have a need, we bring certain gifts. We might not have the skill to think about the 5 other things that need to be considered. Can we be distinctive? Are there other ministries nearby that do the same thing that's going to actually hurt both of us instead of helping? Is this the right way to spend our gifts and resources given the need? Is this the right thing for the local community? And are the demographics changing that this won't fit anymore? So it's one of the things we try to bring is looking holistically before a decision is made. So that's the wide lens photographer. The other, another image that I'd say that the managerial skill brings is what I would call a gem miner. So someone who mines gems cuts deep into the ground to find the sort of the jewels, the priceless jewels buried there. And similarly, a strong manager brings analytic skills and other skills to drill deeply into a problem to understand the nature of the problem and its root causes, knowing that the actions you take would be different for that insight. And I'll give you another example that's a common one. So our schools often in Chicago and in other large cities struggle with very significant deficits. And I'm sure if you've read the paper, you've seen many school closures over many years. Well, this is a classic example. It's in the Archdiocese of Chicago, and I guarantee you it's in every other large diocese. When you look at these 3 examples, there's 3 schools, each with significant deficits. It can be common when people have to make very difficult choices to go to the one that's bleeding the most and says, well, we're going to have to actually close. But what we've been able to do is some work and these are real examples. In this one case, the issue was actually that there was just low-income kids in the school. It was a vibrant school, actually serving a vital function in the community, and that had very full enrollment. This is actually one you wouldn't ever want to close. You would actually want to continue to invest in. St. Luke, negative 225, that one actually has an operational issue. That one actually could do much better. It's just not managed that well. They're actually not paying enough attention to their expenses and their budgets. And without hurting the mission of the school, could actually be operated much better. So that's when you actually think about how you operate better, but you want to keep it open. And then the one up there with 180 has low enrollment, and there just aren't many kids in the community. And so if you just don't do the deep dive, you may be actually closing the schools that are the worst for the mission of the church, when you actually should be closing the ones that you just don't see much growth in because there might not be the demographics. And so how you think about school decisions is very different for having done the deep dive. And so even today, even though the Archdiocese of Chicago suffers financially like most dioceses do, we have never closed in my entire time a low-income school that had vital enrollment or hope for vital enrollment, because that's where we should be as church. The third area is what I call a conductor. A conductor brings together a large group of musicians, all playing different instruments, into a unified performance. They draw out some sections as needed in order to enhance it. And when you have a large institution like an archdiocese or a diocese, that coordination won't happen on its own. And if you actually don't have people who can be the ones who make the decisions, it won't happen either. I'll give you an example, not at the archdiocesan level, but at a parish level that many of you, if you're working at parishes level, I'm sure have experienced. So we had a case where 3 parishes came together and they developed a joint school. And they committed to a set of actions to work on that joint school together, and they committed that it was a priority for all of them. What ended up happening was Parish A, that was his number 1 priority. And so he was very focused on what it took to actually implement the joint school. Parish B said, absolutely, strong priority, but not as high as religious education for me. And Parish C said, absolutely one of my top priorities, but for me it's number 4. Now, they would not have said it this way. They would never have articulated it this way. They would have all said it's a priority. So when those tried to work together, it was a disaster because Parish A always wanted them to move more aggressively and faster than Parish C. And because there was no conductor, it just kept spinning in circles. And so this happens to be a parish example, but in a diocesan structure, you'll find the same thing if it's not managed well. And one of the things that when I work at our diocese or when I talk to people in other dioceses, there's always this complaint about people working in silos and not coordinated as if there's a problem with the people. It's actually not a problem with the people. It's a problem with the structure and the decision-making of keeping it orchestrated. The next image is an image of a plumber. A plumber installs pipes within a structure and makes sure all the pipes are connected and working together. Someone with management skill connects all of the people, systems, and processes to ensure strong implementation of any initiative. When we think about a diocese as large as ours, our bias is to think or underestimate the need for all of this piping. So one example, I know there's obviously been a revisiting of lots of conversations around the protection of children in the church. And there's many reasons for what happened over the past 40 years. But one reason is this, right? When you're trying to actually manage the protection of children, that actually takes a lot of piping and plumbing to make sure your seminary screening is fine, to make sure you're doing the evaluations, to make sure you're doing the right training, to make sure you're evaluating new people as they come in, to making sure you have processes for how you investigate allegations, to make sure you're handling victims well and caring for them well and giving them the right pastoral support. And so if you don't have the piping, the chances are that something's going to fall through the cracks. And while that's not the only reason, I think it is one of the reasons that we had the challenges we had. And a lot of our work is thinking about how you put in the piping for large institutions. The next image is what I'd call metronomoi, and those who speak Greek, I'm sure I messed that one up. In ancient Greek, those were the overseers of the weights and measures in the marketplace. And a person with strong management skill becomes an expert in the weighing of criterion judgments and decision-making. So if we were a small institution and had something presented to us, I think more or less we'd use judgment to figure out what the right answer is in that one thing. But when you have 100 of those things and you're doing that each time separately and independently, first is you don't have the time and the ability to do that each time. Secondly, depending on who's making the judgments, they may make them differently each time. And third, because you might be doing them each time, they tend to get elevated all the way to the top, when if you just had a process, they wouldn't. So I was talking to another archbishop of a large diocese recently, and he was talking about the kinds of decisions he gets burdened with. And a comparison is one that we allow very junior people to make now, because we've figured out how do we weigh that decision, how are we going to make that decision, and we let people much lower in the organization. So in this one case, I'll show you the example. In one diocese, you have the archbishop making them each time. And in our case, we have actually at the very lowest level of person making it, and getting to the same answer often. So this is one where parishes may have questions, a need for capital grants. They have a very significant infrastructure problem, and they come asking for a capital grant. And the challenge is you only have so much budget that you can provide in capital grants. And the way that we probably would have done it before was based on relationships, based on what we understood the need to be, based on how the parish team articulated their case and whether it was compelling or not. But what we didn't realize is we were making them inconsistently over time. That created a lack of unity, because there was some sense of, well, there's got to be some magic way to get a grant, or it's based on who knows who. There was a sense of not fairness or a sense of low transparency. So now when a parish wants to think about needs a capital grant, we ask 4 questions. First, is it a lower income community who never would be able to raise the dollars on their own? That's where we're going to bias our budget. Secondly, is there evidence that the parish is healthy and vital and will be around for a long time? Third is, has the parish done everything they can do on their own first before we provide the grant? And then finally, is the overall infrastructure of that parish manageable? We actually don't want to replace the roof if the rest of the building is falling down, that you then have to close it later anyway. And without really thinking about those and evaluating them, we would find often that, we inadvertently gave a large amount of money to a wealthier parish who could have raised it on their own. They just didn't have it then. Or that we actually put some infrastructure on a parish where the base wasn't stable anyway and we had to close it anyway. And so we have a simple sort of formula by which we do the evaluation. Sometimes exceptions are needed and are important, then people raise it, but we try to be consistent around how we do it. And a lot of our decisions are on how do we think about these decisions, how will we make these decisions in a pastoral, sort of mission-oriented way, so that when they do come up, we have a way of thinking about it versus reinventing it each time. That's one of the advantages of that management skill would bring. And then I'm going to quickly go through a couple others that I think we would probably say as church we should do better than anybody, but I think because we sometimes underestimate the complexity of operations, we often don't. So one is the image of a coach. As you know, a coach brings and ensures that all the people on a team are working together in a unified way for a common goal, and that the people on the team are inspired and engaged, that they develop to be their best, and that they work together collaboratively. And I think this is one area where we assume as church we'll be the best. And the way I always describe it is somehow when we think about church management, we forget what we know. And we know human nature better than anybody. And yet we somehow sort of forget that when we come into a church and assume that people will just work together well on their own, which doesn't happen. And so, there is real management discipline around how you get teams to work together, how you think about developing teams, how you get people working together in unity. And so this is one I see commonly where we just underestimate what it takes to get people working toward a common goal. And the second one that we tend to do better is what I call an audiologist, someone who listens. So we would say we're always working at what it means to be a listening church. And clearly we talk about what it means to be a listening church, but in a large institution, it's hard to know whether there's a real insight or noise because it's coming from so many places. And I'll give you an example of how we think about this often in church. So we are implementing a survey right now of priests around how to think about their health and wellness. We hear all kinds of voices about their health and wellness. They either feel healthy or they don't. If they don't feel healthy, it's this issue versus that issue versus that issue. And we wanted to get input from them to figure out how to prioritize our efforts. So we constructed a survey, we launched it, and a priest said, I don't know why you're asking me to do this survey, just listen to us. And we're like, that's what we're doing. Like, that's what the survey's meant to do, is to listen more broadly so that you can cut her through. And when in a large institution, if you just listen to the latest person or listen to just a couple people, it is really hard to tell whether that's everything. Now, that doesn't mean you always go to surveys, so please don't think I'm trying to numerically listen without other kinds of listening. But I would find that a lot of my time is also thinking about who do we need to talk to and how early do we need to talk to and who we need to get input from and when do we need to get input. And even the listening process takes real planning and management skill. So those are the dimensions, I think, to try to just give you a flavor for what it is. And then the final thing I want to leave with is, I know I'm in some circles often about the idea that if you just let the lay people come or the people with skills come, it would all be better. And I think this is a very important area for co-responsibility, but that collectively we're at the early stages of what it means. So there's a number of tension points that come as we try to think about bringing a new skill to the church. Part one, there are changes. When we think about what we've been doing in the Archdiocese of Chicago, there are changes in the who and how of decision-making. We are trying to include more people who have certain expertise in certain decisions. That may not mean they always own them. They may finally be owned by a pastoral leader. They may be co-owned by a pastoral leader, but it's trying to bring both the pastoral and the skill dimensions in certain decisions. There's a number of tension points, I think, versus how we've always thought of things. So there's this trade-off between the person and the institution. Obviously, we care for our people, and we're focused on our people. But sometimes we make decisions that forsakes the institution and forsakes the mission of the church. So it's how do we think about balancing both? There's another dimension around acceptance versus accountability. So how do we make sure we accept people and have a real Christian community in the diocese and really express Christ's love through our community while still holding people accountable to a certain level of standard? One, I'm sure if you work in church environments, you'll know the expression, which is church nice versus open dialogue. I think there's a common way of just being so polite that all the tension and conflict is under the surface and still bursts out in some way or another. So how do we think about trust-based open dialogues and not church nice so we can do the right thing for the mission of the church? And then finally, there are different languages. And we all have to work on what those different languages mean. There's no doubt that people with my background or other kinds of backgrounds, whether it's a communications person or a lawyer or a business person, brings their lingo in a way they don't realize. And so it creates sort of a bit of a struggle around people not understanding church because they bring their lingo. And so we do try to work very intentionally with people around adapting their language for a pastoral environment. On the other hand, some of the languages matter. And so I am, if you know me, I'm a data junkie. I love numbers, I think in numbers, and sometimes numbers matter. And so even bringing new languages matters. So those are tension points in the existing culture, but there are tension points that come from bringing new skill sets. And I think there's two things we have to be very careful about when we think about new skill sets. And when I mean new skill sets, I mean obviously people with management experience, but I also mean a broader set of skills around just bringing broader expertise, whether, again, legal, communications, others. One is teaching our people to adapt their skills to a pastoral environment. It's actually much harder than I would have thought to do that. I find that people do come in with their ideas of best practice, and then boom, they're off to best practice in ways that would never work in a church environment. And so it's teaching our people how to think differently and recognize you're not here to actually implement best practice as you know it. You're here to determine what best practice is in a church setting, given what you know. And that's much harder than I would have thought. And the second thing I think we need to recognize is that, 10 years ago, I think the number was 56% of Catholic adults self-admitted that they didn't feel they had the confidence in their faith to pass it on to their own children. And I'm sure those numbers are worse now. And so we do have to recognize that sometimes when we bring in our broader skill sets, they do have a strong sense of faith. They do take their faith seriously. They do sort of feel God's presence in their life, but they may not have been formed in the way that you might have understood formation. And so they won't have some of the instincts you might expect. And so how do we handle, that situation when you have people coming in who mean well and do want to serve the church but don't have the same formation? So keys to success, some of which I would say we're still working on in our very at the early stages of. One is recognizing organizational skill as a profession. And so there are people in the world who have gone to specialized training and have developed years of experience in organizational skill. And so recognizing it is a profession just like other professions, that you can't just replicate that easily. That leads to the second keys to success, which is recognizing the right place and the role of training. I do hear a lot about how we're going to train, whether it's pastors or bishops, or to sort of learn the administrative side. And I think one is training won't overcome low aptitude on administration if there's low aptitude. And two is training itself won't bring someone up the curve of someone else who has a profession. It may help people understand what the concepts are. It may help them manage in smaller sets, but we should be clear about what's a profession versus what's helping someone get up to speed on what that is. Third is the importance of onboarding and faith formation. I'd say we're still at the early stages for us. I think we were very intentional about recruiting very practicing Catholics who had different skill sets. And therefore, I think we're caught off guard at the degree to which it's still difficult, even though you're bringing in very practicing Catholics. So we need to work on that. The fourth is what I call partnering of skills. I think in trying to make a good decision for the church, you still need the strong pastoral sense. You do need the functional expertise. You do need the management skill. And often no one person's going to have all of that. And so we work and partner very closely. So in my case, I almost never make a decision without some partnership with someone who's got the right pastoral and theological training. I will never move forward without getting that instinct. In my case, it's very closely the Vicar General, who we work very closely together, or the Cardinal, but we just don't move forward making sort of one-sided decisions. Relatedly, the Vicar General and the Cardinal, when they're faced with a decision that's really mission-oriented and pastoral, will send it to me to say, is there something we need to pay attention to around how to do this? Do we have the money for it? Is this hard to implement? How would we implement it? How do we think about it? And so getting teams working in close partnership is very important. And even in our pastoral center, we will often pair people together who have the complementary skills to try to work together as they think about decisions. And that is, it's sometimes easy to make work, depending on personalities. It's sometimes hard, but it's the only way I can see moving forward, given what's needed. And then the final thing I would encourage is what I would call the what before the how. And so I know in a lot of conversations, there's a conversation around we need, more lay people in more roles, or more of certain types in certain roles, and I think that's true. But often the conversation quickly goes to who should be included and how they should be included before we're focused on what are we trying to accomplish and what are we trying to fix. And so I would encourage to focus on the what before the how. So that is some experiences from our time at the Archdiocese of Chicago, where I just try to give a flavor to what it means to bring management skill to a large archdiocese, and what that means and how it serves the church. And happy to open it up for questions.
Could you speak to the reality that many priests feel that they're underqualified to, it's not their skill set. So on the parish level, we have probably a lot of poor administrators. Take it to the next level, bishops don't just drop out of the sky as people might think they do, they come from the ranks of priests. So on that level too, we have perhaps a vacuum or a lacuna of skill in that regard. That would be one question or comment. The other one is the changing complexion, both literally and figuratively, of the clergy. My Diocese of Austin recently now is a majority of foreign-born priests who are great men, but are coming from very different models of church, very different models of organization, and they're placed in an American and a Texan parish. So maybe you might have some experience of that when you're a huge archdiocese.
Sure. So there's no doubt that there's challenges on both. The first one around priests and pastors and then bishops not having the right skill, I would say they often don't. And even if they have good aptitude, they'll never have the training to actually manage the complexity that they're faced with. And they don't have the time in today's circumstances anyway, when they should be focused on evangelization and liturgy and worship and sacraments. And so the real question is how to bring those skills. My experience is the skills exist and the skills are willing to help. And it's just about being open about how you bring them on board and help. Now, I think as a diocese, we need to help pastors know how to bring them on board better. And there's no doubt that we have challenges with different cultures where there's a sense of decision-making independently when they don't have the full skill set. And that is a tension point for us of how do we get someone to recognize they may not have the skill to make those decisions and to broaden that. And a couple ways we solve it. One is, in our case, when a pastor does not have the skill and then won't reach out to get the skill, we do have teams now that help provide the support and help co-decision making, do some co-decision making on administrative topics. So we do that. But at the Archdiocese of Chicago, when I say about opening it up, so I was talking to the chief executive of Northern Trust, obviously a very large institution. He has one Harvard business grad in his institution. We have 3 at the Archdiocese of Chicago. And he's like, you have more talent than I have. And so we actually found that when we decided to open it up and bring in skill, if I showed you our senior team, it's a top-notch team. Like, people are out there very willing to serve the church. And we have, 3 flavors of people. We have people at the end of their careers, kids are raised, they just want to be in a mission phase. Superstar people, top-notch people serving the best law firms, the best communication firms come at the end. We have people right out of, there's a window of time when people might do a 2-year experience and then they plan to go, the traditional route is get 2 years of experience, maybe do something else for a little while and then go to business school. And people come to us, they want a nonprofit experience before they go to business school. So we've had 3 or 4 superstar talent who then stayed. Like, we actually helped them fund a local MBA, and they're with us still. Where they could do anything they want in the world and are with us. And then others who at various points in their lives. So the potential for talent, it's been beyond my wildest expectation, the degree to which talent is willing to serve the church. And so I think you have to find it. The cultural issues, I think, are real. It's about how do you do more training and educating around what that means, for sure.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. As a diocesan worker, this gives me great hope. Coming from more the formation perspective, that especially got my attention. But my question has to do with, how is significant prayer a part of how you operate and what you do?
So I think if you were to walk into the pastoral center, whether it was before the management skills came or not, I think it's one that we would say that we would, to be honest, struggle with. And what I mean by that is people actually, even the priests at the pastoral center would say that they're out with the communities and they're out with their parishes and they're out doing things. And then when they get to do the business, it's our business. So I would say we do incorporate prayer. We try to have a monthly First Friday Mass together. We do try to do something on the sort of the liturgical, during the liturgical calendar. And we do have a retreat every year, and something that we do at Advent. But I would say, more or less trying to find the balance between, deep prayer and reflection and getting the work done of the church is a constant tension. I think no different than our own lives, right? Of how do you prevent the busyness of work getting in the way of a prayer life. But so I would say it is a tension still. It's difficult.
I'm not sure this is radically different from the other question, but we have 15 full-time permanent people on staff, 12 paid interns, $1.7 million budget. So okay size. And so there was something that came up, and on one side of the table is a lawyer and the chief financial officer and insurance company, and then me on the other side. And when I listened to all this, and I think we're very well, I think that our diocese would agree as well that we're a well-run parish, that I listening to the other side in this issue, it seemed like we were not leaving room for the Holy Spirit, for the spiritual, for the sense of mercy and charity that has to be incorporated, as far as I'm concerned, as the pastor, has to be part of my decision-making process as well. It has to be well-run, and we thanks be to God that over the past 10 years, our October pew counts keep going up, so thanks be to God. But there are other things that have to come into my decision-making process as the pastor of the people that are working there as well.
So I think you're exactly right. And I think there's 2 comments. One is, I don't think any decision-making process is now saying, hey, there's this formulaic way to make it, and it's all going to be driven by efficiency and management and legal. Right? I think the idea is to say, and many of our decision-making criteria now are about under what circumstances and how do we think about, biasing towards, certain pastoral priorities versus anything else. So in our schools, for example, if you were to take a more of a hard-nosed efficiency, sort of business, legal point of view, you would have closed a very different set of schools than we have. Because in our criteria, the first criteria is service of the poor, And the second criteria is that there's vitality there, and that's where all of our dollars go. And so today, we actually serve the poor through our schools more than we would have otherwise, because we wouldn't have had a sense of how we actually, spend it. So the trick is in partnership, making sure that what you see as the important pastoral dimensions are in there. And that there's ways of talking about exceptions too, so that you can actually make the right sort of decision of mercy, if that makes sense. And the way I think about it is it's doing it, with reasoned sense, right? So sometimes a parish will come to us with a difficult set of circumstances, and we'll look through the criteria and say, whatever the decision-making criteria is, it should qualify or not for something. But then sometimes we absolutely say this is an art, not a science. So in this case, we weren't thinking about this particular issue where you need to make more of a mercy-based or a personal decision. And it's just doing that in unison so you know when you're making the exception and how you're making it. And so while there's no doubt there's still tension points, I think ideally this isn't about taking away pastoral decisions. It's actually helping to make better ones, but there's no doubt there's some tension points there.
Hi, yes. To what extent do you think the very structure of their church prevents the hierarchy from listening to you, others like you, trying to bring modern management theory into the church? For instance, just as an example, my own experience, following that first person's line of questioning, it's unfair to expect priests and bishops to have management theory in their curriculum, at least not very much. So as a result, what they do is they end up being rubber stamps. They delegate it to those lay people in their community who do have the expertise, but because of what appears to be church structure, they have to rubber stamp the decision because all governing decisions have to go through them. And that puts a drag on the church. It really is not a proper accountability. No corporation will be run that way. And I'm just wondering, so how much is that due to the structure of the church, which predates this management theory by 1900 years?
So I don't think it's the inherent structure of the church. Actually, I think that we've actually just not benefited from the management skills, and so we may not have helped a bishop or an archbishop understand how to get the help they need to make the better decisions. And my experience is that they are very open to getting that help, but they don't know where to begin, and that when we assume they're just going to know, that it doesn't work. So let me try to give you an example. I remember working with some of our vicariate, our auxiliary bishops when I first started, and there was a sense from the staff members there that the bishop he won't make the decisions he needs to, or he just won't do it, or he won't let us make the decisions. And my experience is when the bishop understood what we were trying to do, and that at the end of the day, of course he's the bishop and makes the decision, but this is helping him, I find more often than not very willing to get that help. And it's about, I think, helping our pastors and bishops just understand what that skill is and how to use that skill. So even in our case, I think in working both with Cardinal George and Cardinal Supich, we set very closely sort of what are things where he sets the parameters of how we do it, and then my job is to get it up and running, and I will make all kinds of decisions day to day, knowing that sort of overarching infrastructure. And there's all kinds of things that if I were running a business, I just make the decisions that I run by him all the time. And so it's figuring out how you work as a team so that he actually always feels like I've set the parameters, I know what's coming up, and I try to tell our own teams, over-communicate, right? I will give him a very long list of here's the things we're working on. So things sometimes do pop, where he wants to have more of a say or he knows something. And so it does take a lot of close interaction in a way that would be different than another institution. But my sense is when I do spend time with bishops wherever they are, they're hungry for help. That's my sense. That they do feel that they've been given this very large burden without the right experience, and that they're being asked to make all kinds of day-to-day decisions that really prevent them from, thinking about evangelization and ministry, and there are ways to help. So that might be that. I think there are ways absolutely to help and do this in a way that obviously the bishop still has the overall authority on decisions, if that makes sense.
Thank you for your presentation. I actually live in the Archdiocese of Chicago. So we're going through the Renew My Church process, where some of the parishes are either merging or closing. My question is, what's happening to those parishes, to those properties? Is the community being consulted, and are they involved in what's happening to those parishes when they're no longer a sanctuary?
Sure. So the Archdiocese of Chicago is facing similar situation than just about almost all the other large, especially in the Midwest through the Northeast, that had the sort of the earliest dioceses. And there's no doubt it's a very painful and difficult situation given what's happened with Mass attendance and the practice of faith of the people. And on the one hand, you'd love to say that we will keep our churches where they are. We're finding that we have many, many very large church structures that house very few people that can't even come close to maintaining the structures. And then often, while they can be very close-knit communities, don't have the ability to evangelize in a way that we would need in today's circumstances. And so that has led to very difficult consolidations, just like most other large dioceses. And I'd say we're doing ours later probably than others. What we have constructed is a very intentional process to get input. And but depending on your experience, it shows the difficulty of getting that input. So what we do is put parishes in groupings. The groupings form grouping teams, and then they all come to the grouping team to share sort of their visions for the future, their hope for the future, and they have a chance to provide input on scenarios of possible configurations, and they have an ability to propose new ones if they want. And their job as the grouping leaders is to go back to their community and talk about it with their community. I am in the meetings when the grouping teams of different parishes come together. And in the beginning, there's no doubt there was a lot of difficulty around the pain of having to close and concern about what that means. But as it's evolved, I found those grouping teams come in very clear-eyed about the challenges we face, newly committed to what evangelization means today, and recognizing sometimes there's difficult choices in order to evangelize in the future. They almost never come in and say, they'll never come in and say, close my parish. But they will always come in and say, of these 6 scenarios, we think these 2 are okay, and we think those 4 are terrible. And the majority of the time, we go with one of the scenarios the community picks, almost the majority of the time, because we are trying to get their input. And there's no doubt that sometimes you hear in the news that, hey, I wasn't consulted or we weren't involved. And I think that shows the difficulty of trying to get everyone included. Sometimes the people who come the loudest have people who just aren't participating in their faith that much, right? But they sure come out when it's time to close the parish. And so we do work very hard to get that input, and obviously are always looking for new ways to do it better.
So it's exciting to hear about the culture of collaboration that's growing in Chicago, and it's wonderful to hear how your cardinal and your priests are so welcoming of that collaboration. But what about places where that culture hasn't developed? So in a place, for example, where there's still a unilateral perspective on leadership and a fear that if I encourage my laity to participate in leadership, I will lose control and the mission of the church will be lost. For example, very common in places where I am an advocate for lay ministers is you might have a group of very well-equipped, educated lay ministers leading productive ministries, perhaps for 6 years, and things are growing, and a new pastor is assigned who doesn't have that vision, and because of his authority, his canonical authority, he can dissolve it instantly. So how do you address that problem where there isn't yet a flourishing culture of collaboration?
So my sense, a couple things. One is, I do want to start from the concern that was raised here, which is I do see people coming in who have a very strong point of view about what the church should do who are not formed. And so I do understand sometimes that concern, right? Or they're going to overrun important pastoral decisions because of whatever expertise there is. And when I say that we're at an early stage of discernment, I mean that, right? I actually think on both sides, I do see often how people come in with just a they're not the appropriate mindset in a church. So I actually understand often the hesitation and the concern, because getting that right is not easy. The second thing is, there's no doubt, and I think when you mentioned different cultural environments, that is an issue. One of the things we're trying to do with the Archdiocese is open up how we think about decision making so that any one person is getting more input. So we just had a conversation a couple weeks ago about how to give input to our pastors from the dean level. The deans are they sort of gather groups of priests together so that there isn't just a unilateral decision making that often may be not skilled sometimes. And so we are trying to think about how you provide checks and balances so that there is more of an openness to different ways of doing things. But we're sort of at the early stages of that. So I would say you do see great examples in some cases, and you don't see great examples in others. We are trying to think about how to broaden the input as we think about decisions. And then the other thing I would say is, at least at the diocesan level, is even when we think about the imperative of new evangelization in our parishes, we find that some parishes are very willing to move forward and very excited about thinking about it, and some won't get there. And that the way we've evolved is we're going to focus first on the ones who are ready to go and help them be a model for others, because you can't, it took us 2,000 years to get here. We're going to be here for a long time yet and don't have to solve it all at once. In a similar way, I think there are more and more, at least, bishops being very open to, I think they feel overwhelmed more often than not. I think they're looking for help more often than not. And same thing at the pastoral level. But your point around how someone can on a dime change a decision, you do see it still. And I think that's something we collectively have to work on.
Friends, we have time for one more question.
Yeah, as a retired bean counter, there's always a question of accountability and how do you measure success and how do you define what success is. You talk a lot about, the decision-making process, but then the ongoingness to know if what you intended, how it results, either, both on the quantitative, there's the quantitative measurable, and then it's always a challenge to make the qualitative, to quantify. Is it,
Right.
Is it number of people in the pews, Sunday collections, whatever. So I was wondering what is your, I guess you'd say, accountancy system?
So we do think very, very hard about it. Maybe that should have been one of the other images, like as a sort of a measurer. We do think hard around what measurement means and how we think about measuring what we're doing. And sometimes there's easy ways to measure, like, did we get to financial stability in a way we weren't before? That's easy. The way that we often think about it, so if I think about one of the hardest ones, which is we're trying to help parishes think about evangelization, right? And that's something that you want to seed now that may not even have fruit till much later. We do try to think hard about what that means. And the way we think about it is we try to measure, first of all, openness and interest. And people demonstrate whether they're open in interest, whether they come to conferences, whether they come to summits, whether they reach out for input. So we measure it based on who's showing openness and interest. That's the first thing we measure. The second thing we measure, are they doing the things that we think they should do as they get started? So are they thinking about a soft entry point outside of the Mass to introduce people to a life of faith? Are they actually doing the things we would suggest that they should do? And then the last thing we'll measure later is those outputs, like, is the parishioners growing? So we do try to think. One of the other things we're trying to measure is what we would call, we don't have the right word for it yet, sort of the champions of evangelization. Like, how many people are willing, how many priests are willing to sign a piece of paper that says, I'm committed? And that's one of the things we're going to measure soon as one way of measuring the growth. And so we do think hard about metrics, and we do try to think about creative ways to at least get some sense of, are we making the kind of progress we want, not only because it's qualitative and hard, but the timelines we're talking about are very long too.
So friends, with that answer, we've come to the end of the hour, actually. And so let's take this opportunity to thank our speaker for our enlightening talk.
Thank you.